Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome. Today we are in the study of the future is open. We're in the third session. And well, I just thought to start off saying, when we're studying karma, as we're doing right now, I think as most of you are aware of, we're not studying some mysterious science. Of course, it's tempting nowadays with the situation that we're facing in terms of the coronavirus to think, what karma did this? And actually in the Buddhist teaching, we're sort of generally discouraged from speculating. The Buddha himself, he said, speculating about these things is pointless. It takes a complete omniscient Buddha to actually understand which particular action led to which particular situation. So with our study of karma here, we're not studying some sort of some way that we could all of a sudden begin to understand the details of what's happening, you know, clearly. What we are, however, studying is what it has led. Just like we in natural sciences, we would study the periodic tables, we'd study the various laws that we have about energy, about gravity, about thermodynamics and what have you, to understand the general principles, and that helps us navigate our interaction with the phenomenal world. That's what we're doing here, but we're extending just beyond the limitations of just sheerly the physical. We're extending into the realm of our experience, which is the most immediate, and that which actually goes beyond subject and object. It's the most encompassing science there is. And in here, we're then looking at what are the causes and conditions and understanding, not so much that you need to do this because that will lead to this and so forth. Not at all like that, because with karma, we're not only talking about cause and effect, we're talking about cause, condition, and effect. So if you're planting a apple seed, yes, you'll get an apple tree, but also the way that you treat the seed. If you just leave it in the ground without watering it, without manure, without sunlight and so forth, won't necessarily be that great an apple tree that you'll get. So in this way, the science around karma is not one of just a very simplistic, this leads to that. It's complex. But the bottom line is that because phenomena are caused and conditions, they don't possess any ultimate reality. And that's where we tend to go wrong. We fall into a delusion where we begin to think in terms of what we perceive as having a solid reality. And that's, of course, where we, in the Buddhist teaching, speak about samsara, about us getting confused. And so with the teaching of karma, we're not only talking about the conditions that are created, but it also that us to actually understand things don't exist solidly the way they do, and that actually leads for us to understand we could do something about our situation. And so that's an important thing in this present, you could say, climate of worry, that it's about also so much about directing our attitude. And that's where we're working constructively with karma. So it's pointless pretty much to think what led to this. What is, however, what we're taking from us with this is an understanding that what I do presently has an impact on the future. And that's not only in terms of the physical aspects, which are important. For example, with the coronavirus, we're encouraged to take care not to transmit this to others. And for that reason, we wash our hands, we do all sorts of things to avoid passing it on. And so there's a lot we, of course, do on the physical level, but also in terms of the psychological level, we generate bodhicitta, we generate loving kindness. We do various things. Possibly, if you're a Buddhist, then you would chant particular chants, like His Holiness Sakatrinsen was referring to a particular chant by Tangtung Gyalpo, a great Mahasiddha. So there's various things we can do. So the point really with understanding karma is so much to begin to understand that we could actually work with our conditions in terms of our reality. That's the point. And ultimately also see beyond conditionality altogether, which is the scope then of enlightenment. Now, last time we looked at then the conditions of where we are, but also very much with the understanding that, like I was just saying, we can do something. And there might be a discomfort that tells us something is not quite right. And this is the point, of course, in Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's teaching and the teachings in karma in general, where we got here through confusion. Now, what we're going to look at now is how to unravel the confusion. But to do that, we first need to be aware of our given conditions. So we're now going to look at the second part of the book, which is a description of samsara, but it's very much from the position of us actually being able to do something about it. So it's not like we're doomed and we're stuck in this. It's, of course, a situation that's considerable, and it's worth us attending to this. If you look at the image here, we see the principle of yama that represents the experience of time and the basic sense that we all operate with of time and space. And this is then where we have various conditions that shape our existence. But look, we also have the Buddha outside, pointing to the moon. And that's the implication really of the science around karma, is that ultimately we can go beyond karma. And yet within the phenomenal world, within the reality, relative truth that we experience, then we can work with the given conditions. But as far as us presently, then working with an understanding of our reality, we begin with looking at the foundations really of what we're given and also what we can do. So in chapter 5, we're looking at karma itself, and we're looking at basically what it's founded on, which is the confusion that we call ego, and also with the recognition that this confusion is removable. We're not stuck with this particular condition, and that's what's implicit in Buddha nature, that as much as our confusion might develop into all sorts of perceptions and experiences, there is continually this abiding, unchanging nature that's entirely free of that. So that's, of course, where we speak about enlightenment, and that is the nature of the path, that there is a path of remedy. There's the path out of confusion. What we're doing here is very much let's see, working with confusion through an understanding of how we got here, and then basically addressing confusion directly. And that's what we do with the practice of meditation. Now, when we hear about meditation, then very often it brings an expectation and also the path of enlightenment. And with that expectation, we're a little bit preoccupied with what might be rather than relating to what is. And without relating to what is and just thinking in terms of enlightenment might come one day, and the gurus are so wonderful, and there's so many wonderful people who are practicing the Dharma, or maybe people practicing Dharma are not wonderful, whatever it might be. We're externalizing it instead of just looking at what's happening with us. And that is where we need to relate to exactly who we are. And this we call skillful means or vehicles. Depending on who we are, depending on our particular condition, disposition, inclination, and so forth, we have these vehicles. And this is what we call the yanas, the various yanas. Now, approaching this, then, we could do so in terms of just surrendering to the faith, surrendering to the church, blindly just tagging along with what we're supposed to do as good boys and girls, or there's the intelligent version of that, which is actually being aware of what's happening within myself. How does confusion operate? What is the pain, and where does this pain come from? And that's where the intelligent faith is about working with our existing conditions. So the blind faith is more about a fantasy. It will never be what we think it is. There's nothing's not operating on the premises of our present ideas. Rather, what we need to do is working with what is. And of course, what has brought us all to this, and where we begin the path, is a healthy disenchantment, what we sometimes refer to as renunciation or determination to be free, where we can see just stuff, externally accumulated stuff, which naively most sentient beings, they think is the cause of their happiness, getting what they want. And that's where we're beginning to suspect that might not necessarily be the case. Now, if we engage with the path thinking that, oh yeah, well, if I'm on the path, then I'm going to be much happier, I'm going to be satisfied, we're still operating with the premise of our self-centered agenda. And so that's not going to help us either. Finding relief on the path through meditation, through being with great gurus and so forth, that's not really going to do it. The gurus are there to teach us something about ourselves. The path itself is indeed it brings relief, but it also has a higher objective. So in doing so, we work with using our intelligence, our rationality, and also our experience, our intuition. So this is the purpose then of meditation. This is where we begin to touch on our confusion and begin to unravel it. Trungpa Rinpoche says, according to the basic Buddhist teaching, in order to learn how to meditate and to learn the basic philosophy of meditation, you must know how the confused mind, the ego, the self, or whatever you'd like to call it, operates. So this is where, when we're approaching the path, we need to know what our given circumstances are. So we last time looked at these three kinds of ignorance. There's the basic ignorance, there's the ignoring of discomfort, and then there's a labeling ignorance. So these three, ignorance of our ground, and on the basis of that, then we think, this awkward, insecure experience I have, that's basic. And with that sort of initial embarrassment, insecurity, we engage as if that was given. And that's why we would say that comes from this ignoring the discomfort or just insensitivity to that there's something wrong. You might not even think there's something wrong. So anyway, once we have that, and we have this duality, self and its object, then we begin to label the reality accordingly. We begin to say good, bad, this is how I see it, this is how I want it. And we essentially just have continually an operation with us not really relating to reality, but just freezing reality and pasting our labels onto it. This is, of course, what we can undo, and that is the point of meditation. But when we have this condition, that's where we begin to then think in terms of I like this, I don't like this is good, this is bad, and that's where we begin to act. And this is also, like we saw last time, that's where karma begins. So all of this takes place within a confused condition. So this is what we are onto in terms of us. When we sit down and meditate, we're addressing that. There should be some sense of us actually doing something about our basic ignorance. Trungpa Rinpoche says, to be precise, ignorance is not so much a tendency to disbelieve in the totality as such, but more likely it is a tendency to disbelieve in the individuality, the particular sparks of energy that occur, the sparks of intelligent energy, compassion, or wisdom. We tend to disbelieve that the flashes that occur in this particular outer space are separate entities. The very fact of not believing in them as separate entities only produces or reinforces separateness. A little bit I don't know. It just seemed to me this was something from last time. Sorry, I'm just having a moment of doubt whether I have the right. Yes. Sorry, I'm just. Yes. Sorry. Oh yeah, this is it. Sorry. There was a little bit of an unexpected event, which is not an excuse, but more. So I haven't been able to do my homework as I normally do. But look, there is something here that's not okay. Let's see here. All right. This fourth one. Sorry. So yeah, I'm taking you backstage. I hope that's you can handle that. Oh. Let me just see here. Look, this is what slide 4 is supposed to do, but I somehow have not. I think number 5 is okay. Number 4, somehow we have an old slide from last time. Now, what this one should be? Okay. So here's the development of the ego is not the final event that happened in the past, because there where we're talking about is that the condition that we have is not something that's frozen, and it's not a solid thing. It is rather it is like a river. It's not a solid thing, rather it is like a river. Okay. Okay. So it's something that's continually in process. It's in flux, right? So just like a river is continually changing, and yet we still label it as the same. And that's in fact what ego is like. We can see that, okay? We're encouraged also to verify this through our own observation. Now, there's a fundamental intelligence that's aware of this constructed nature of ego that somehow instinctively questions what's going on. And that might be more or less developed. We would say the degree to which that is developed, you could say the Tathagata Gaba, the Buddha nature, is uncovered. So that's something where we instinctively are questioning this ego. There's something, even if we're not specifically as philosophers or spiritual people questioning this, there's some sort of insecurity. There's a very tentative quality around our basic sense of self. And the degree to which we could begin to be clear on that and begin to actually connect with the open quality of reality rather than the closed quality of ego is when we begin to experience some degree of openness or gaps. That, of course, is the implication of what we could be doing when we meditate. And here, then, there is a possibility that we could have some sense of the uncontaminated original ground, Tathagata Gaba. For us, then, we might say, oh, that's very frightening. We could be feeling very vulnerable. That's okay. Okay, so Trungpa Rinpoche says, the possibility that there may not be ego at all, that there may not be me as such at all, is a very powerful threat. Suppose that is true. Then what? Out of this fear, we want to create some basic solid thing. But in order to make something solid, you need some material to work with. The only solid thing you have to work with is the experience of self. So you try to solidify that space. You try to freeze space. So this is where ignorance takes place. And of course, this is not particularly mystical or situated in the past. This is where we begin in the middle of something, you could say, that's open and natural. We begin to label it. You know, it's a bit like if we go out in a beautiful place in nature, And right away we have to take a picture of it, or we have to write a poem, or we have to somehow objectify it instead of just leaving it. Okay. It's hard not to have a self-centered agenda, because the teachings are like a carrot constantly dangling in front of our noses, telling us that if we apply ourselves to the path, we will purify obscurations and achieve greater states of perfection and calm. Paradox. Hard not to become jaded and feel ripped off. Well, to feel jaded or to become jaded would really just mean that we're not actually taking it to heart. There has to be the engagement of the teachings. So of course we're just using language. So when you talk about I am achieving enlightenment, that's language. What we're talking about is, of course, also that it's not a self that achieves enlightenment, it's a freedom from the trap of self. So this is where Trungpa Rinpoche very often talks about the first thing you need to get, the first thing we need to get clear on in teaching is that it's full of paradoxes. So yes, we're working with enlightenment, achieving enlightenment, yes, but at the same time, that enlightenment doesn't come from dreaming, it comes to relating to what is. So that's where once we begin to actually apply ourselves to the path, then the sort of then this worry actually is not so much there. It's a bit like if we say we get well. Well, actually, we don't get well. Let's say we're sick and we have a curable condition. We say we get well. It's not really that we get well. It's just that the illness goes away. So again, it's just about language. Then somebody comments about that. Doesn't it boil down to our motivation at the end of the day? Yeah, sure, that too. Yeah. So, and here I think we can go back to, I'm assuming the rest of the slides should be okay. So, and this is where, right now, we're just looking at the theory of this, but this is what we bring to the practice of meditation. And so, ignorance is not something that is about not knowing, but it's about us practicing ignorance. And that's where this experience of ego and everything that goes with it, like, for example, the agenda of me, it's not a bad place. We're not bad people because we fell into that. But it's just confusion, and that's where we want to address this confusion. That's what we do with meditation, which is completely different from anything we've ever done, because we sit down and for once we don't have an agenda. We're not going anywhere. And that's why meditation, the way we sit down and think what's going to come, that's not going to help. When we have some instruction in meditation, then we apply that wholeheartedly, and that's what weans us off the habit of wanting what comes next. I can upload something that I'm always, whenever I do retreats and instruct in meditation, there's a very succinct, short instruction from Chögyam Trungpa meditation that's so good. And the first thing that he says is, this is not about us trying to attain some hypothetical experience of enlightenment, but rather of us relating to what is here right now. Anyway, the thing is, and this is again about us mapping ego. This is not about how to say moralistic judgment of ego. It's about mapping how did this confusion come about, and how does it play out? Because there's something that's going to play out when we sit down and meditate. Is something that plays out continually in terms of us operating from the place of our insecurity. And one thing is that we don't want openness. We don't want to just accept things this or accept things that. We operate from the place of selecting what we will accept and what we won't accept. And that's essentially something that perpetuates this falling back into our sense of I. And that's also when once we have that sense of I and particular likes and dislikes, that's where we then act. And that's where karma begins. So this is where it's plays out in terms of our experience of our world and our experience of our individuality and so forth. But all of this comes down to this duality where we think this and that, this as opposed to that. And for example, we would say this is long, this is short. Sure. But again, it's very relative. There's me and my projection, me and the other. This again is something that's entirely, if we look, actually we cannot find neither a solid self or a solid other. So this is then this experience where we begin to freeze reality, and this is the process of the first skandha, the skandha of form. This is essentially how samsara begins. Trungpa Rinpoche says karma is dependently generally on the relativity of this and that, my existence and my projections. So the birth of karma is continually trying to keep extremely busy. In other words, there is a fear of being idle. One must constantly try to prove I do exist, I am what I am. This fascination in this case is a kind of pathetic measure of trying to entertain oneself with panic in a very clumsy style. So this is the basic condition of our sense of I. Of course, we can intuitively see that we're much better off when we're open and not caught up in that. And we can also see that there's a dynamic in which on one area, one extreme of the scale, we get very tight. And also we also have moments of being very open and relaxed. Okay. 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 We're gonna. It's fine. I will take questions, but they have to be first of all. Try and make them a little bit short. Is it possible our understanding of being well is not lined up with our expectations or common understanding of what wellness is? Certainly, because we don't really. This is all new material, so naturally, normally we are actually working with an ignorance of our condition. So this applies, of course, due to particular conditions, especially if we have been sick our whole lives. That's been my experience anyway. The more I practice my reality, isn't necessarily nicer or calmer. It's just different. And then I doubt if it's working. Yeah, but that's of course where we're not interested particularly in a nicer or calmer reality. We're interested in the one that thinks in terms of this is nice, this is not nice. And this is where we're operating. This does require experience. And presently what we're doing is providing the ground for this experience to actually try to map what we are proposing. And that's where we're distinguishing between when we operate within a sense of I, ego, and that's where we begin to say we have a nice reality, calm reality, we have an anguished, angst-ridden, difficult reality. And that's continually relating, that feeds the whole sense of I. So the basic premise of I is that we're assuming that there is this I. And yet at the same time, we can see that it's actually a place where we're not really relating to reality, it's not really relating to what we are. That's the proposition of what we're doing here. So once we have this initial freezing sense of me, then there's three ways that we react. React with indifference, neutrality, passion, which is then attachment, what we want to have, and aggression, what we don't want to have. So with passion, we'd like to have a calm reality. With aggression, we'd like to avoid upheavals and discomfort. Neutrality, indifference, this can be a strategy of just choosing to be deaf and dumb, choosing numbness. And this is where we could sometimes say, well, I'm fine, but actually we're just being numb. So that also is still a place where the sense of self is still there we haven't necessarily gotten to the bottom of things. We're just not experiencing any upheavals, you know. What, as per Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb sort of thing. The passion is feeding ego through grasping. And again, we have an object that we like, and then once we have it, there's a sense of more sense of me and confirmation of me. This is why we might think, oh, this is basic to who we are. Yes, but try and notice those that are free from that. Someone like the Dalai Lama, or even in our ordinary reality, we might find people who aren't necessarily caught up in this game. So we might have an intuitive appreciation of it. Trungpa Rinpoche says, if we felt that we were rich enough already, we wouldn't do this. But we have a feeling of poverty or hunger, a feeling that we're not strong enough, or that we're not basically proving our existence, a feeling that ego's survival mechanisms is not sufficient. So we make a pathetic gesture, trying to grasp, trying to magnetize other things, trying to label things as our property and grasp them, hold on to them. And that is where we then try to gather things on the premise that we lack in some regard. Conversely, we have aggression, and that's also a pathetic gesture. And that's one of speed, where we're feeling threatened in the sense that there's something that's preventing us from getting what we want. And at that point, we're not really, again, being sensitive to reality. More, we're sort of like, we're going to make this happen because we feel that something's against us. So that's where we have aggression, where we need to sort of roll in with our particular agenda. Trungpa Rinpoche says, we feel that we can't survive, therefore we have to ward off anything that threatens our property or our food. We also feel that we have to push ourselves as fast as possible into situations. That this kind of basic speed is involved in aggression. So these are the sort of the basic, you could say, the basic reactional patterns once there is self. And then we have the third skandha, which then is about beginning to organize, in the sense of that we begin to have some sense of how things operate. This is good, this is bad. It becomes much more sophisticated in the sense of having some concepts on things. And this is also where there's sort of a strategy that's seen as being intelligent, that we're beginning to navigate according to what we want and according to what we don't want. Can you enlarge on the use of the word speed? It doesn't seem to mean speed in the usual sense. It means restlessness. It means impatience. It means that we are moving faster than our intelligence. It means that above all, we are giving into habitual patterns. So we're just acting basically on autopilot. And that's where there's a lack of awareness, there's a lack of mindfulness in that. That's of course why, for example, Thich Nhat Hanh, he encourages moving slowly, eating mindfully, and all of that. And of course, Vajrayana practitioners should be doing that too. And it is really just to interject presence within our experience of every moment. So the fourth skandha of concept or impulse engages action. So that's then where we are determined that this is good or bad, and we're going to act accordingly. So we have this definite sense of that there is a reality. It's solidified. I, the object of what I perceive, and then we are responding accordingly. So this is where we are basically operating from. This is where we do things. So you could say up until now, there's a sense that we're operating within the realm of the confusion, but now we're, on the basis of the confusion, we're putting down patterns. And that's where the fourth skandha, samskara, is about impulses and action. Interestingly, right now in the Abhidharma that we're studying on Mondays, and also to some extent the mindfulness teaching. Anyway, certainly in Mondays, we're studying a chapter from Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, which also is dealing with the 5 skandhas. So the 5th skandha of consciousness is then where we begin to take this experience of I in terms of everything that comes into me, our sense experiences. So it's all the various perceptions in terms of sight, sound, etc., the 5 senses, and then also thinking. This we call the sense experiences. It includes thinking, so we call this the 6th sense, different from, the 6th sense as in clairvoyance or seeing things that other people don't see. And then also a basic conscious, what we call the afflicted consciousness, that is then the emotions. So it's with the combination of what we're perceiving and also our emotions, our likes, dislikes, pride, jealousy, and so on, then we have all the experiences of consciousness. So these 5, they basically constitute what drives us. Now this, if we trust the Buddha, then we go back and we see, how is that? That's where we need to say, okay, I'm going to trust the Buddha on this one and go back to see, how does this work? It might not be immediately obvious. And that's where it's a bit like if we're studying natural sciences and somebody says, there's an animal which is it again? It's both a mammal and it lays eggs, the platypus. And then we say, no way. But if we trust the biologist, then we might say, okay, interesting, this person found something, and then we might actually accept it. And so we could go and verify. We could go and see if we can find platypi and verify the truth of this. Similarly, also with the practice of the path, it's very much about then looking. Do I mind freezing reality? Am I relating to reality? And what's the basis of then this sort of perception of reality as existing really, in terms of me existing? Well, I certainly operate with a sense of I like certain things and I don't like certain things. And it does actually get me into sometimes I work myself into an uptight place. How is that exactly that? Well, I'm labeling these things as good, as bad, and this informs my actions. This becomes part of my whole sort of being, my character. And that's where we could begin to identify these skandhas in our experience. Now, the point actually of the saying that, okay, there's 5 skandhas is actually saying there's nothing that runs there's nothing there other than it's like a river. There are these elements, but there's not a unitary sense of self. That is where you could say the healing lies. That's where the Buddha is teaching us and saying, it appears real, but it's not as real as you might think it is. And that's where the proposition of Vipassana comes in. And that is why we meditate. To allow openness, not that we have to sit there and think, okay, I'm this, that, and the other. That would be outside of meditation. You can study this. But when we sit down and meditate, this is where we're actually beginning to let go of certain patterns experientially. So we identify that emotions, they wreak havoc. And the reason why they do this is because they're not as intelligent as they would like to think they are. Our emotions tell us, I'm going to be happy if I get this thing. And we end up being miserable because we got the thing and it doesn't make us happy. So the havoc is done, or the damage is done, simply because emotions ultimately are not intelligent. They're diminished wisdom. They're lacking the experience of the light because it's operating from blinkers and from very dark, dark glasses, lenses. So this is where emotions, they wreak havoc, and they don't get us where we want. This is what the Dalai Lama is always saying. All beings, they want happiness, and yet they pursue the causes of suffering. So we would say their motivation and their action stands in contrast. And certainly, as far as the ego goes, the ego is miserable because this is the ego that's sending out the orders, and yet the ministers, they're doing a botched job of achieving that. All of this is really just for us to begin to be a little bit, you could say, less submissive to the narratives and the belief systems that ego builds up around itself and also about its reality. That's where we're saying, my present worldview has failed me. I'd like to see beyond this. And that's where we might take refuge in the Buddha as the guide who would introduce us to that, which you could say takes us outside of this unsuccessful enterprise. Trungpa Rinpoche says that seems to be the beginning point where the emotions become painful because we're not quite certain of our relationship to our emotions. Tremendous conflict arises from the feeling that the basic me is being completely overpowered by my emotions. There is a tremendous struggle over losing one's basic identity or one's basic self. So the pain of emotion comes from here, which is also part of consciousness. So our basic frustration and so forth is the starting point really of the journey. The first truth, the first noble truth. Emotions and feelings, are they different? Are emotions and feelings different? Well, feelings, you could say, operate on a very basic level of simply just our radar tells us this is, I like this, I don't like that. But then once we begin to interact and we begin to we have invested in these patterns and so forth, then we begin to have these strong senses of attitudes and opinions and habits and so forth. So we could distinguish between emotions and feelings in that way. Otherwise, basically, they both operate as, you could say, the ministers or the henchmen of ego. So they're both emotions and feelings. They operate with this like and dislike. But we could say feeling is a bit more basic, emotions more sophisticated. Now, what we're doing here is not that we're going to say, well, I'm bad, my whole being is bad, and so forth. I'm punished, I'm doomed, and so forth. There's none of that. It's just we've gotten ourselves into this. And that's where we begin to dismantle the wall of the ego brick by brick, in the sense that we begin, sit down, even just sitting and being calm, already there. Ego doesn't have much to play with. The mere fact that we are uncomfortable sitting down and not moving is already proves us that things are working. This ego is not really so happy with that. It's not being confirmed. That's where presently the study of the mindfulness in action is quite specific. Last time we were talking about the cool boredom. And so when we begin to dismantle the wall of ego brick by brick, it's the simplest thing of just sitting down or whatever it might be. Maybe rather than flying off the handle in an angry reaction, we could think, okay, let me just try to be patient. Already there. So we needn't think in terms of enlightenment far away, but we could simply just work with these little micro moments of not being deceived by ego. And that's where what we're working with is not about changing the world out there. It's working with these patterns of our thoughts and our emotions. Of course, what comes up in our mind and what's present in our reality, that's not the problem. It's about how we engage with them. So that's where if we fixate, they take on, you could say, a life of their own. They become solid. If we don't, they come and they go. Now, to do this could be very idealistic and think, oh, I should just let things go. Not so easy. And that's where meditation is very helpful in terms of us beginning to have an openness. We're beginning to connect with that which is beyond just me and my strategies about my world, simply just connecting. This could be just relating to the kitchen sink level of our experience, keeping a clean house, relating to people in an open and accommodating way, being present in terms of what needs to be dealt with, paying our taxes, That's a general sense of developing an open relationship to our world, not resenting our world. But specifically, meditation then is for us to be onto this mind that constantly is grabbing us. And that's where we begin where meditation is very helpful, because it enables us to not be carried away and distracted by this undertow of continual narratives and attitudes and thinking. And that's where we begin to get over ourselves and begin to actually connect to a wider space. We're not being told what we're going to see in that wider open space, but the thing is, we're basically just beginning to be less controlled by these narratives. And that's where we understand how also the stuff of our mind is not innately bad, it's innately pure. The movements of our mind are not innately confusion, they're innately wisdom. It's only when ego employs the energy of the mind and diminishes and fixates according to the particular lenses of ego that confusion happens. Innately our being is wisdom. Trungpa Rinpoche says the emotions, or any process of mind, including the emotion, the thought process, and everything else, could be used as part of wisdom. They become wisdom in the awakened state of mind. They are just there, but they have a different flavor altogether when viewed by the awakened state. Emotions themselves are not the basic awakened state of being, but they're part of its color, so to speak. So the movements of mind, when we're no longer fixating, naturally they possess these qualities. When they are frozen, as we do when we fixate, then they become these painful conditions. The awake condition is free of the paranoid ignorance of ego. And from that point of view, then, we're not, from that condition of awakening, we don't necessarily operate within the same agenda. We don't operate within the space of ego. And that's why we're comfortable with whatever there is. Now, in presenting this, Trungpa is not trying to say, okay, when you sit down, you shouldn't have paranoid ignorance. We are paranoid. We do have ignorance. What we're just talking about is that there's a potential for healing. There's a potential for us getting over this. And yes, there's dangling a carrot in front of our nose in the sense that there's a sense to this path. We're doing something worthwhile. But at the same time that we have a vision of where we're heading, we need to start with where we are. Trungpa Rinpoche says in these sutras, when Buddha teaches, he may use the words I and me to refer to himself. This is an expression of what is called discriminating awareness wisdom, wisdom that can perceive the whole area of things as they are. This wisdom transcends self, but it's not that there is nothing there. There is a greater awareness of things as they are. So we'd say if the Buddha is teaching and he says I, that's more sort of according to the audience that's there, in order for the audience to be able to have a handle on this. And this comes from then the Buddha's awareness that goes beyond the ordinary self, but it's something far greater. It takes in the scope of the reality. There being listeners. Can you say more about emotions as colors? Does it mean they're indicators of states of mind? Well, it's more that when we operate from the, you could say, unimaginative place of ego, then emotions are really just the places. It's really just the afflicted conditions of I'm getting what I want, I'm not getting what I want. So it's an afflicted condition, and so we're not really relating to our reality. We're relating to just this painful experience. And that's why we are saying that in and of themselves, the movements of the mind that appreciate, or that you could say enable us to relate to the world, it innately is intelligent. They innately have pure colors. But within the coloring of self, then you could say the pure colors become a bit tainted. They're not as clear. So this is all about just us being aware that we actually needn't be stuck within these particular lenses or the particular condition of confusion. That's the implication. We're going to look at this this famous, and this is possibly one of the first, how do you say, visual aids that we have in world history, I would say. It said that Moggallana, he drew this in the sand as he was trying to explain to some of the other students of the Buddha, basically the principles of what the Buddha was teaching. So if you go to Tibetan temples, this is actually always outside of the temple. You could say this is why we go into the temple embodying enlightenment. Then outside there's the reasons why. And essentially, if we understand the wheel of life, we actually understand what so much of the Buddhist teaching is telling us. So if we're studying medicine, we're going to be studying anatomy, we're going to be studying diagnosis, we're going to be studying illness. Of course, the implication is that we could do something about this. And it's in understanding illness that we can be free of it. Enlightenment is when we're free of the constructs of our confusion of samsara. Essentially, what really on the immediate level actually operates on us is this experience of passion, aggression, and ignorance, attachment, aversion, and ignorance. Ignorance here can refer to the basic confusion that constructs self, the basic unconsciousness, and it can also refer to this numbness that just is not feeling particularly passionate or particularly aggressive. Anyway, we have this it's called the wheel of life. I don't know if I would call it the wheel of life. I would say it's the wheel of half-life. It's the wheel of not actually experiencing life. So we sometimes I think we can refer to it as the wheel of existence. But anyway, this is the word we're using presently, the wheel of life, as in samsaric life. So the workings of samsara understood through this wheel of life, or what is called the Baba Chakra. Baba means becoming, and Chakra means this wheel. So the one that holds this is Yama. This is the personification of confusion and the personification of time and the personification of our struggle. And when we understand this wheel of existence, we begin to see where suffering comes from, as in the Four Noble Truths. We see there is suffering, we see where it comes from. We understand that there's possibility of being free. And from that point of view, then we engage in the path. So you always see the Buddha representing the third noble truth, that this is a curable condition, and pointing to the moon. So here you have all the various conditions. You have the cycle of the 12 nidanas that we're going to look at, how we got ourselves into this. And the result of that is then what we experience in terms of the 6 realms. And with the understanding of the 6 realms, then we understand what drives the 6 realms, which are these 3, basically what we call the passion, aggression, and ignorance, in terms of a pig, a snake, and a rooster. And also in terms of here, actually, we have some, Trungpa Rinpoche doesn't refer to this, but this is actually part of the path. There's the certain actions that freeze us up, and the kind of the actions that just removes our freedom, restricts our wiggle room. That's the negative actions. So actions that are less caught up with the unimaginative agendas of ego are these white actions that lead us up. And here, these are the actions when we are severely caught up in the habitual patterns and self-centered practices. This leads to lower experiences. So we say that samsara is, there's the higher realms up here, less suffering, and there's lower realms down here. So there's 6 realms: the human realm, the God realm, and the demigod realm. And down here we have the hungry ghost, the hell realm, and the animal realm. So this wheel of life shows the chain of conditions that drive samsara. What's important here is also to understand we're not talking about some external power. Yama is not an external power. This is just our confusion. And these are then the conditions that operate from confusion. The bottom line is why the Buddha would say get out is that there's dukkha, there's dissatisfaction, which could be of various kinds, but as long as it's operating within this delusion of duality, it's going to be endlessly circling. And that's why we might sometimes be in the higher realms, but most of the time we're actually in the lower realms. So until we're free, we are held by this delusion, by yama. Okay, so we we have the outer ring, and so there we talk about the basic ignorance, this personified by the blind grandmother. Now I would have liked to, and this is where I was a little bit held by time, but up here, if you study some of these and you have them in your book, and also you can find them on the web, you generally have these images available. So the first one is ignorance. This is the confusion we've talked about before. And this is the blind grandmother. Trungpa says that she's the progenitor of further generations of confusion. And stuck in her ways, she's busy with the grandchildren of confused projections. She's continually sort of seeing things in terms of how she believes they are, and they then take on, this confusion takes on lives of their own, the further generations. And this is the ground bewilderment, the ground delusion of self-centering that continues throughout all of the 12 links. The second one, samskara, is then the impulse and so forth, where we essentially, just like a potter has this wheel and constructs reality, then we similarly, also driven by our karma, we begin to have particular ways of doing things, our patterns of action. And the potter's wheel is our basic condition of becoming, and the duality of self and other is like the water and clay. So this is just an overview. Of course, you have it beautifully explained in terms of Trungpa Rinpoche's explanation, so please refer to that. I'm more just going over that, you could say, the main points, really. But by all means, please read what Trungpa Rinpoche says about this. And this also is something that, there's a lot of categories here, right? There's a 12, then we're going to look at the 6, then we're going to look at the 3. So they might be new to us. Don't be discouraged. This is like anything. If you're going to learn to drive, there's a million things you need to know. And similarly also, if you're going to be working with the mind, this is very helpful. But if it's new to you, don't worry. Just you'll come back to it. Consciousness. So we have ignorance, we have impulse, then we have consciousness. There's a sense of I. There's a sense of the activity that goes with that. I am a colorful person, I'm a monkey, and I do what I do. And that's how we present ourselves to the world in terms of interaction. So then we have the name and form, persons in a boat, where we begin to have a place we're going, we have a name, we have a role, and all of that is very much how we operate as what we feel is me, and this is what we'd like to satisfy, this comfort zone. So this is how we present ourselves to the world in terms of name and form, in terms of persons and going somewhere. Now then we have the 6 sense faculties, which is a 6-windowed house. And normally you will also, sometimes you see monkey in there because this refers to the 6 senses and how the monkey is looking out, first one window, then the next. And actually it's very interesting because it actually means that monkey can only look out of one window at a time. If we look, we actually can only be aware of one consciousness at a time. We maybe switch back and forth, but essentially we do operate within micro moments of just using one consciousness. Then we switch to another. So that's how we relate to the 6 windows of consciousness. These are sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind. So this is where monkey operates. And yet, and this of course is the premise, there's a subtle discomfort. So this is how we operate in terms of our perceptions. Then we make contact, and this is then what Trungpa Rinpoche says. Then it's like the married couple or lovers. We engage with the world, we touch it, we confirm. We have a sense of I and me in relation to the world, and there's also we don't just relate to the world in a very sort of academic way. We get involved. And hence the image of the lover. Trungpa Rinpoche going into quite some detail about how we as lovers actually, we probe each other and get very close. At the same time, and what could be the situation with our interaction with sex and the love contact is that it can be quite serious. It's very much about me. It's we take it serious. And then we have the arrow through the eye. There's something which is not quite right. So we have these strong feelings that come from our world. We know, right? We have. We accept it, but it's something that actually we're continually, we're continually propelled from one situation to the next that's either pleasurable or painful. But the bottom line is that we're constantly afflicted through that basic disposition of me. Even if it's pleasurable, it's not going to really last. It's like he says, things might be pleasant, but we still have an arrow in our eye. So whatever we might say, this is my life, it's still very conditional. It's still very held by duality. Then there's craving, drinking milk and honey, which is something that seems to be easy. Our craving is based on this thought that things are going to be great, and if only they were great, and when we get it great, it just goes down so well. We all know this when we're getting what we want, right? And that's where we have a sense that we're not autonomous. We want this from coming from objects. There's some objects that we want, whether it's things or people or status or whatever. This is what's going to make us feel good. So we're coming from a place of neediness, of desire. So then we grasp. When we get things that we like, we are trying to hold on to it. So we are moving through the world. We're continually operating with optics that are focused on what we want. And so we have this agenda continually of wanting to find the pleasurable places. This could be nice. We could vacation in this place, when we can travel again. Or, we'd like to make this, we'd like to arrange this room so it'll be, a particular room for our purpose. We want to continually establish things that we feel good with. And then there's the becoming, which is the copulation. That's where we're entering into the interaction with the other, where we're continually going somewhere. We engage with the other, but also when we engage with the other, all of a sudden we become entangled. And then the situation takes on a life of its own. And it's sort of like snowball effect. It leads us from one place to the other. So that's where us and our interaction with the world is very much about becoming. Incidentally, this is what we call the whole of samsara, bhava or sipa. This is becoming. That's what we're doing. We're never actually just here. We're always in the process of going somewhere. Western philosophers like, Heidegger and Sartre and so forth, they very much have juxtaposed this becoming versus being. So it's a sort of a theme that's familiar. But anyway, the Buddhist implication here really is an indication of the basic, you could say, givenness of our experience with the world, that we're continually involved with this becoming. So with that, then we have birth, which is that we are actually entering into a reality, and then we're finding our place. It begins to confirm us, gives us power, and this is then where we are sort of hoping that particular situations are going to bring something, and that's where we enter into a situation really in the terms of wanting to establish ourselves, become born. Yet again, when we find ourselves in one situation, it doesn't last. And so once we have a situation, we're already in the process of losing it, old age and mortality. This is the dissatisfactory nature of samsara. And so with the old age and death, we experience decay and death. And yet in doing that, we're always about to get born again. Like this, what is it we say? One thing collapsing, something new arises, right? So the end of one thing is the beginning of something else. So we might think that now we're dying, we're losing it, but very often our experience in life tells us that something else is up ahead. But at the same time, also what's implicit in old age and death is that we're weary, we're tired. This continually change and so forth is no longer something fun. And of course, if we look at our lives, we certainly don't think of old age and death as something that's fun. You know, when we're young, then, oh yeah, this is, you know, I'm growing up. Hey, I'm 1 year older. Yes, you know, when you're older, then it's not at all like that. So what we then have is that all the experiences and you could say that we have, they more remind us of what was rather than some exciting sense of what comes next. So that's the 12 rings, and they are, again, this is something where we need to basically look at how this applies to ourselves. The classical presentations of these can be a little bit cerebral or philosophical. They're very accurate, very precise. But if we're not familiar with the vocabulary, they can become a little bit inaccessible. And that's where Trungpa Rinpoche's very intuitive presentation is very helpful. The inner ring, and then again, if you look at the image, we can see then the 6 realms. And these are then the various experiences of samsara, which they're constructed by the mind. Of course, when we approach this as Westerners, then the realms of samsara are very much new material. And so I think in the introduction, in the preface, Carolyn Rose Gimian, she was talking about Trungpa Rinpoche's students reacted when they were informed about the realms of samsara, how they generally understood in the Buddhist context. And that's why Trungpa Rinpoche, from then on, he would just talk about the core, the actual seed of, you say, where these realms, how they originate in terms of psychology, because that's, of course, much more, you could say, verifiable, immediately, you know, something that we can experience. So for people who haven't grown up within the Buddhist cosmology and so on, that seems, you know, not only alien, but it also buys into some of the disqualified discourses of religion and religious intimidation and religious horror, and, you know, Hieronymus Bosch's portraits of hell, which are very much seen as tied up with brutal agendas of a manipulative church. So that's why, of course, people reacted to these kind of presentations of what the various realms are experienced as. And so Trungpa Rinpoche wisely then just simply talked about samsara in terms of how it is constructed by the mind. So they appear to us as real external realities, you know, yet are creations of the mind. So similarly, also New York City seems like a very real reality, yet New York City is a creation of the mind. Our relatives, our friends, they might seem real, but also they are constructions of the mind. So all of these realities that we experience in terms of the 6 realms is something that exists in terms of our perceptions of something that is durable, but it's also, if we want to really understand the actual micro moments of samsara, it's something that happens all the time. We're continually dying in terms of, we started this webinar 7:30 here in Australia. That's a long time ago. That moment's dead. That's gone. Now we're being born here at, what is it again? 8:40. So we're continually born and dying all the time. And that's also the beauty of this momentary quality, is actually like we can say it's a bit like changing clothes. We can put on a fresh set of clothes, and there we are. Every moment could actually be like that. So that's how it appears, and yet time itself is something that we can't objectify. It has no reality whatsoever. There's a lot said about that, but we can verify for ourselves. Of course, we experience time, yes, but can we find time? Can you find the past? Can you find the present? It's already gone. Can you find the future? The future is not there yet. It's tricky. Definitely time is an appearance. It's something which appears to us, but we can't find its essential nature. So the inner ring shows how the confused mind finds different styles of occupation, which are called realms. Such realms can be said to refer to psychological states rather than external situations, such as heaven above and hell below. So that's traditionally how we have a rather simplistic version of our reality. And of course, our reality is very much, and this is also even in the physics, you can say more advanced physics, quantum physics, and so on. We understand that the so-called reality that we live in is very much just a state of mind. So let's look at the human realm. Human realms, they're intelligent, they work with causes and effects. They actually think in terms of how to invest present activities in order to accommodate situations in the future. Yet, again, coming back to emotions and so forth, due to ignorance, they suffer from dissatisfaction. And that's the human realm. Sort of, I wanted this, but it's not happening. Not all the realms have like that. Then we also talk about the human realm in terms of what we call the 4 great waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. That is something that we're all familiar with. And this is also what the Buddha initially, when the Buddha decided to embark on the path to enlightenment, this was the encounters of these were what determined him to leave behind his former lifestyle. So the good thing about the human realm is that we know sufficiently about suffering that we could actually be motivated to practice the Dharma. That's the extraordinary condition of the human existence. And that's why we talk about, for those who practice Dharma, we talk about what we call the 8 freedoms and 10 advantages. Trungpa Rinpoche says, suffering in this realm has the nature of dissatisfaction. The intelligence of human nature becomes a source of endless pain. Deliberate, self-inflicted struggles lead to the pain of birth, old age, sickness, and death. So again, we can understand birth, old age, sickness, and death in terms of momentary experiences. And this is why we can say we could be very intelligent, and yet with this intelligence corrupted by the self-centered agendas of the emotions, we end up having pain. God realm. As a God, we are focused on pleasure. We are absorbed in pleasure, possibly, and that's where the highest, most subtle existences in the God realm are really just practices that are completely free of any physical inhibition and just abiding in a condition of absorption, samadhi. The thing about the God realm is that whether we are in what we call the form of formless gods, regardless, then eventually with these conditions that got us there, they exhaust. And so we know through the insight of God, we know where we're going to land. We know what comes next. We lose our the causes for us being in the God realm, and we know we're going to experience lower rebirth. Trungpa Rinpoche says, when the karmic situation of being in heaven wears out, there are suddenly violent thoughts accompanied by suspicion, and the whole blissful state collapses, including the self-conscious concepts of love and the insecurity and the security of being in love. So all this sort of self-absorbed conditions of bliss, they are replaced by all of a sudden the panic that this is all going to be lost. Is dissatisfaction in the human realm the same as dukkha? Dukkha is universal for dissatisfaction all across the various realms of samsara. We would basically say the entire samsara is a dukkha. So as long as there is duality, self and other, we have this tainted condition or this confused condition of duality. There is suffering. The cycles in the human realm sound like the interdependent links. Look, the interdependent links are very often modeled on the human realm, but they apply to all the 6 realms. So they're on the outer ring of the circle. And so they're really what drive all the different conditions of samsara. They're what drives the condition of the duality and the ramifications of duality. So that they're universal for all the 6 realms. Then there's the animal realm. In Tibetan, it's dudro, which means to walk with your head down. And that's, of course, we're not discriminating against many charming, intelligent animals. We're just talking about an example. And we're identifying the basic helplessness of animals. So we're not discouraging compassion for animals. We're not how to say, slamming them for being something they're not, because of course many animals have very intelligence, pigs, dolphins, and dogs, cats, whatever. But the basic condition of animal is that there is a seriousness, and there's also a lack of vipassana, if you like. There's not the conditions there for enlightenment. So we essentially have this limited condition of being an animal, being unimaginative, not knowing anything beyond our particular experience. So we plod along, and this is not just animals, this is also animal mentality as we live it in the human realm. Of course, this happens to us every day. And obviously, like what's implicit here is that these 6 realms, they happen every day for us. We're sometimes in the God realm, we're sometimes in the human realm, sometimes in the animal realm. And the animal realm is characterized from just thinking in terms of my struggle, my conditions, and then we have this struggle, and then we go on to the next struggle, and we're all the time perpetuating particular patterns, reactive patterns, and that's where we're blind to the openness. We don't connect with, and we don't experience then the flow and the dance of situations. So in the animal realm, Trungpa Rinpoche says, whenever there is an overpowering force that might lead you to explore new territory, the immediate reaction is to play dead or to camouflage yourself as though you are not there. This realm is marked by stubbornness and by intoxication with yourself. Again, this is something we can look at in terms of our own experience. If we feel slightly sort of miffed on behalf of the intelligent animals that we know, that's not the point here. The point is that this is something that we are perpetuating. So we very much should look for our own practice of the animal condition and understand where it is we're limiting ourselves. Then there's the hungry ghosts. Pretas. As hungry ghosts, our poverty prevents us from letting go. That's the basic experience of poverty, is that we couldn't dare or couldn't bear to let anything go. We're basically hanging on. And so this comes from a basic sense of poverty. The external veil that we talk about here is the hungry ghosts. They experience kind of obscuration. And one is about just that we want things, and we want things. And then the internal obscuration is that even if we get things, we can't actually experience them. So one is the poverty that leads us to continually feel that we don't have enough, We want more, 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 more. And we, even though we do get things, we actually can't really enjoy them because we're sort of still wanting more, and we're just, it's not quite what we wanted anyway. So this, and then in terms of the individualistic or self-centered obscuration, this experience in the hungry ghost realm is this, that we're continually wanting something, and yet what we're wanting so badly is continually tainted by or poisoned by the fact that we feel the whole world is against us. So we have this miserable existence of not actually of poverty, and also by how do you say, a sense of fear about the world around us. So this is Hungry Ghost Realm, and again, this is about us looking at this as it crops up in terms of our experience. You have this described in Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. You have this in the chapter called Six Realms. You have this in Myth of Freedom, in a section called Styles of Self-Imprisonment. And you also have this described in the classical works, such as the Words of My Perfect Teacher, and also Finding Rest in the Nature of Mind, and so forth, these various realms. Hungry Ghost Realm, Trungpa Rinpoche says, on the whole, the pain of this realm is not so much that of not finding what you want, rather it's the frustration of the wanting itself that causes excruciating pain. Hell realm. In hell, our aggression extends to the environment. So once we're involved in aggression, we perceive this in terms of the world around us. And we can also see this when we begin to have anger. We begin to also see the world coming against us. So that's where our attempts to escape, that we're resenting where we are, it accentuates our pain. We know that everything is wrong, everything is against us, and we feel we're victims of circumstances, and we want out, and yet we can't. So then you have two kinds of hell, hot and cold. So the hot hell is the inability to stop anger. So that's why we can't stop ourselves in terms of our mad engagement with the outer world. And then there's the internalizing, that's the cold anger, is that we are still experiencing the same anger, but we're internalizing it. And that's where it hurts. So one is about, because they're acting outwardly, and the other one is internalizing, but they're both painful. Trungpa says, in the hell realm, there is a tendency to commit suicide for the relief of a change of scene. And this is, of course, a reference to we die a lot and then we get revived. It says, but each moment of change and each repetitive birth seems to take millions of years in this realm of hallucinations. There is not a moment to spare for anything other than your own existence in hell. So that way we can see, as we sort of spiral inwards and downwards in terms of hellish experience, we become more and more, you could say, immersed in that experience. So then finally, we're looking at the center of the wheel. Right down at the core, basically, this whole thing is driven in terms of three emotions. And remember, we started off saying samsara really is this struggle that's centered on these three kinds of dynamics: ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And this is then where we start off with the ignorance, which is symbolized by the pig, and the applicability of the teaching is seen to be annoying. Let's say we come across the Buddhist teaching and it's just annoying. There's a problem and there's a solution. We don't want the solution. We just like to say, yes, you do have a problem. You really have a problem. It's very real. And that's where there's this kind of like downward looking seriousness that is refusing to look up and look beyond. What's implicit then in this is that with the teaching and the application of the teaching is that our familiar ground of holding on to our version of reality is actually being exposed. There's actually somebody switched on the light. It's very uncomfortable. And that's where in ignorance, we would like to remain deaf and dumb. And unfortunately, within the context of the teaching, then that's not possible. So that's how we, in terms of exposing the ignorance, then the pain is felt. Trungpa Rinpoche says, traditionally, that deliberate ignoring is symbolized by a pig. The pig represents non-discriminating perception. You relate purely to the sense of survival, consuming whatever comes up to be consumed. With ignorance, you're always grasping for what is comfortable and snug. It's basically ignorance. We might think, oh, we don't know. But here it's different from I don't know. It's about purposefully or being determined to ignore, proactively ignoring. And that's where we could say, well, I just want to stick with what's familiar. I don't want to know. And that's the pig. That's ignorance. Passion is this initial basic sense of I need something. I want to draw something in, and draws in the object. Gosh, well, I mean, okay, forgive me for. Okay. So that's where we see things. I want this. Then I'm going to feel so much better once I have that. And we do this through strategies. The thing is, because we're so involved in our strategies in terms of getting things, and then we have to maintain it, we're actually not. We miss out on the actual beauty of the object, whatever it might be. Trungpa Rinpoche says the rooster's display of its colorful feathers and beak can draw in the object of passion. Passion is seen as eliminating the beauty of the phenomenal world as it draws in such beauty by a succession of games. Passion. Aggression. The snake. The snake poisons or paralyzes the object of passion. So, like we saw earlier, aggression is when our strategy of passion doesn't work. Then we begin to become active and aggressive and move out, not just in terms of seduction, but in terms of warfare, in terms of confrontation, in terms of aggression. And that's then the snake is a symbol of aggression, the pattern of aggression, and the pattern of aggression and passion is seen as capturing that which is close and destroying that which is beyond your control. So to sum up, then there's one is about seducing something that we can have, and when we can't have it, we destroy it. So that's how that's one way then of describing these three strategies. So what defines samsara is that we're very caught up in it, that we take everything very seriously because it's all about me. So when we fixate on things, we hold on to them. And it's when we begin to fixate and hold on to things, we're no longer really interacting with the object. We're no longer really free in our interaction. And so that's where we basically subscribe to our own death. The objects are no longer alive, they become heavy, inert. So at that time, or what we call this moment of samsara, is a place where we're actually ignoring the life and the colors and the freedom that is innate to phenomena, and rather we are on the basis of self-centering. We simply just go deaf and dumb. We begin to have a solid sense of I. We're like a rock. And this then begins to become a pattern, which is then what we're looking at here in terms of the in terms of the wheel of existence. Trungpa Rinpoche says the wheel of life or the wheel of existence seems to be a complete portrait of the karmic situation of how we end up here. It has nothing to do with the transmigration of the soul. For that matter, the notion that we continue with our life has nothing to do with the idea that we ourselves exist. The continuity is simply all the changes that take place. It is like spring and autumn changing to summer and winter. So what we have is a continuity of change, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean that there's something that solidly exists. Just like the river, or just like the beads on a mala. Can you give an example of how we might use passion and then aggression in daily life? Well, for example, when we begin to appreciate something, like say there's a flower in the meadow, or there's something that's beautiful, a person or a situation that's beautiful, that we don't necessarily need to begin to do something with it. And aggression, how we could, if we recognize aggression, is that we're patient, we slow down, we don't react with anger. So essentially, passion, letting go of passion and discovering is the beauty is by not having to cram it into our agenda, not necessarily picking that flower in the fields, but just leaving it there, appreciating it for what it is. And aggression, not giving in to anger, being patient, beginning to see gaps of space. Yeah? So final lines from this chapter. Trungpa Rinpoche says, we put so much effort and energy into our life, and each time we do so, that results in something. And when we work on that result, that produces a further result, which makes us do something else. So we are constantly going on and on. Action or karma is continuous. As long as we live that way, we die that way, and we are born that way. The truth of death is the truth of life. So death is not regarded as an escape from or an ending to our life, but death is the beginning of another birth, and that process takes place constantly. So here again, when we're talking about karma, when we're talking about death and rebirth and so forth, we're not talking about some belief system or something speculative, but it's about, and what Trungpa Rinpoche is encouraging us, is to see how this is happening all the time. Moments, situations dissolve and transformed into something else. And that we can see as a process that is constantly present within our experience. Okay. All right, I think that's here. Let's see here. That's next time, 5 and 6. No, this is me not. This is me just not. Like I said, I was a bit interrupted in the afternoon, and hence a little bit sort of a few things I didn't manage to attend to. So please read chapters 7 and 8. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you.